Me too. Well, I'm just going back to Tahrir Square for a moment, and it would be negligent of me, this is once in a lifetime, to not ask you. Obviously, it's an epic thing that's happening right now over in the Middle East, and if you look at maybe Egypt specifically as a model for how modern media could be used as a vehicle to effectively make change, do you think that the West will take example from that, or is it just something that's a phenomena?
Well, we do it all the time. I mean, for years, almost all the organizing and activism has been somehow through the internet. Social media haven't been used as much as they have been there, but remember, those are, those are states in which those were highly authoritarian states. There were no other means of communication. So sure, Facebook was a means. Here it is too, but less necessary. We can do other things.
Okay. Like perhaps, yeah, we have access to all sorts of, I guess, ideologies, but we talk about these external forces which may or may not help to shift our perspectives and our behaviors. But what about the internal mechanisms? Is it necessary in order for there to be an organized society for the individual to have an internal governance mechanism?
Well, otherwise, we couldn't survive. Nobody else could survive. The question is what kind of internal governance mechanism would be. I mean, society couldn't survive if people just randomly went wild.
So what sort of mechanisms would you point us in the direction of?
Well, that's what, first of all, a lot of them are instinctive. So take what you're doing. But that's instinctive for children. The children just aren't normally creative. You put a child with paints and they'll start painting and drawing. So there is an internal kind of exploratory creative drive. And there are also, I think probably the classical philosophers, like say Adam Smith, were correct in thinking that sympathy is he thought the core human instinct, and help for others, mutual aid, mutual support. These are things you find in every community, whether it's a family or a larger community. And there are also aggressive instincts which have to be controlled and constrained. So humans are complicated creatures. We have to work out an amalgam of these things.
So we have, thanks to yourself as an academic and many others, we have a sort of a critical discourse that we can approach when criticizing or even just analyzing the external forces. What then would be the mechanism by which we use, or the metric by which we use, to assess the success of the internal mechanism?
I suppose it's a family. If they can cooperate to help one another and ensure the maximal development of each person's potentiality and interest, it's successful. If they're undermining and destroying each other, if it's one of those families Tolstoy was talking about, and Anna Karenina, well, then our metric says it didn't work.
Fascinating.
Remember his comment that there's only one way to have a happy family, and many ways to have an unhappy one.
Yeah. Indeed. Wow. So we've kind of, as a society, almost moved a little bit away from the notion of the family and more into, individualism, and that being sort of more governed by a larger collective, which is sort of fed to us a little bit. Are we using that, or can we?
Well, I think it's worse than that. I mean, the United States in particular has become a highly atomized society. People have very little interaction with one another. There are practically no groups, no organizations. Activist movements, for example, almost always are based either in churches or universities, and that's because that's all there is. They're not based in union halls because there aren't union halls. And in fact, there's been a major effort over the past, well, it goes all the way back, but intensive in recent years to try to destroy interactions among people and to separate them and isolate them. Now, that's what consumerism is about. And consumerism is an old story, but it keeps reviving, and it's independently. And the point is to try to trap people in individual existence without concern for others. That's the main thrust of the huge public relations industry. It's maybe a sixth of U.S. GDP is marketing, and marketing is largely concerned with control and atomizing and separating. I mean, from the point of view of those who run the society, the optimal social unit is a dyad consisting of you and your television set, or maybe the internet these days, but no contact with other people. Right. Contact with other people is dangerous.
So you can almost come full circle then to Foucault and the panopticon and this perspective of kind of just keeping watch and making sure that the unit is functioning appropriately.
It's a kind of it's a totalitarian ideal, but it's realized to one or another extent in every power system, to a lesser extent, we should hope. But in ours, it's not. I mean, it's partly. Attitudes and opinions are very intensively monitored to a large extent in order to incite individual consumerism. In fact, if you look back at business propaganda, 100 years ago when the whole huge system took off, it was quite explicit about the need to direct people towards the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, to fabricate wants. If people get trapped into that, they're not going to bother us. We'll be able to run the affairs of the world the way we want. But, a main purpose a main goal always of any form of concentrated power is to keep people off our backs.
So then I suppose the problem would be that it's the type of enforcement then, or the type of rules that are put in place through this mechanism. But at the same time, could we not add creativity to that? Instead of it just being pushing consumerism, is it possible to include an element of sort of alleviating the need for creative function and yet still have a totalitarian hierarchy?
Well, the trouble with creativity is it's going to be independent by definition, and that means it will challenge. It'll challenge received opinions, accepted attitudes. It'll be. I was just talking to a violinist in the Kronos Quartet who told me how they had Allen Ginsberg and reading Howl in Carnegie Hall, and they weren't invited back for 10 years. Well, okay, that's what happens when you allow too much freedom,
Mm-hmm. But is it freedom, or is it just certain ideals that are sort of resisted to be challenged? And, maybe if there was a vehicle to kind of let it happen, this idea of the matrix, allow for an element of freedom but control it at the same time. I mean,
people have to be allowed a degree of freedom. I mean, even slaves were allowed a degree of freedom, otherwise it'll explode. And in fact, one of the ways of a sensible totalitarian system is also benevolent. It spreads. Take, say, Saudi Arabia, which is the most extreme, radical, fundamentalist dictatorship. But they keep the population more or less controlled by giving out, distributing some small amounts of the huge wealth that they have. In fact, you can see that all over the Middle East right now. As the dictatorships are threatened, their first move, invariably, is to try to offer something to the population, so divert them from